Everything's really great. So we'll get started. Happy Earth Day, everybody, and welcome to the Carbon Leadership Forum LA Hub April meeting. Kathleen is going to be presenting today on calculating embodied carbon using BIM360. So I believe you've dropped the link into the chat to open the model. And if you guys have an account with EC3, you can follow along. Before we get started, we always give a brief introduction to CLF, the latest news, and a very short embodied carbon 101 for anyone who's joining us for the first time. So first, an introduction to us. We are your instigators of the LA Carbon Leadership Forum Hub. We've been organizing this since around this time last year. So it's been a really good year for getting the embodied carbon reduction community rolling. So I'm joined by David, Jill, Kathleen, who'll be presenting today, and Luke. Luke, do you want to take the news updates for today?
Yeah, so I think we always try to start with some news and like the latest in embodied carbon, or climate in general, because it feels like there's always so much stuff going on. So we were talking about a little bit earlier. This week's a big week for the Biden administration. Today, they announced the target of 50% reduction by 2030. The UK had a similar ambitious 78% by 2035. And then Carbon Cure, and I'm actually not sure. Does anyone know do you know what Carbon Built is, Laura, or anyone else?
That article said they're based in LA, actually.
It's a similar sequestering in concrete technology.
Cool. So they both.
Carbon Built is the guy from UCLA, right? Who's been.
Oh, okay. Yeah. He's actually going to give him and his couple of his students are going to give a presentation later in the year. So that's great. Very exciting that they won this X Prize, so they should have a bit of funding from that. Does anyone else have a story that they want to share before we move on, or any new news? All right, I think we can keep going.
That was enough news for one day.
Yeah. So there are also a couple of new resources that have come out, been published recently. One by iStructD, and another one, a new mass timber design manual that's
I think we'll be
Alita
sharing
probably
the
knows. Yeah,
links
drop a
for
couple
those
links
in the chat. So check those out. Our next event is going to be a joint happy hour with the New York CLF Hub. And I think we will be pasting a couple of links into the chat. This is going to be a speed talks kind of event. We're calling it 3 minutes of brilliance. So if you have a great idea for reducing embodied carbon, or a really cool project that kind of expresses one big idea that you can convey, pretty quickly, that's impactful, we would love to hear from you. Our goal is for everyone who attends in May to come away with a variety of different ideas that they could apply in their practice. So we'll be pasting a link to the submission form in the chat. If you have something you want to talk about, put it in. We want to hear from everybody. And Luke, is this the sustainable concrete event?
Yeah, so there's another, just an event that I saw pop up May 5th. I think it's through AIA California. Yeah. It's about
awesome.
Specifying concrete performance-based specifications.
Cool.
So we'll drop both those in the chat as well.
Yep. So I will give a very brief introduction to embodied carbon and LCA for anybody who's new. As we all know, I think we've all seen this graph, climate change. It's a problem. We're doing something about it. And this one. So everybody has heard this statistic over the years that building operations are responsible for 28% of global emissions, and that kind of number has always fluctuated around 30%, 28%, 30%. The piece that a lot of people in the AEC industry are becoming increasingly aware of now is embodied emissions. So building materials, the sort of main core and shell materials are responsible for about 11% of global emissions. And then we also have that 10% for other building material manufacturing in yellow. And those are the emissions that are happening up front when building products are being manufactured and buildings are being built. So if we add those two together, we are responsible for about half of carbon emissions. And so if we want to understand embodied versus operational carbon, there are many life cycle stages that are involved with constructing a building. Usually we're talking about, when we're talking about like building energy use and operational carbon and energy efficiency, that's just one kind of small piece of the building's life cycle. So that's operational emissions. And then everything else from extracting raw materials to transporting those to a factory, manufacturing something, getting that onto the site. Those are all embodied emissions, and those are happening at the very beginning of a building's lifespan. So with our aggressive targets that President Biden has announced today, it's really important that we as a building industry are addressing that stuff because it's happening now. And the other piece of that is also demolition and what happens to the building materials at the end of their lives. So that's what we're talking about tracking here, and that's what Kathleen's going to talk to you a little bit more about today. And I think at this point, I will turn it over to Kathleen.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. You can hear me okay? Awesome. Cool. Okay. Let me share my screen. Let me share this. Can you all see that? Does it say Happy Earth Day?
Yep.
Yes.
It does.
Okay, cool. So Happy Earth Day. I guess I guess I should introduce myself. Hi, I'm Kathleen. I'm a senior sustainability engineer at Burrell-Happold. My background is in architectural engineering, so a pretty good place to be thinking about embodied carbon, both from a perspective as a mechanical engineer, the construction management side of things, and also as a structural engineer. And I think that's really important because it's, a lot of times embodied carbon might only kind of get just how like operational carbon kind of just got pushed into like the MEP side of things, or sometimes embodied carbon just gets put on the front door of the structural engineer, but really, it takes a village to make a sustainable project. So, everybody has a role, regardless if you're working in interiors or you're an architect or, you're someone who handles CA, or you're a construction worker, a manufacturing worker, someone who's starting a business. We all have a role. But I think that's like a really positive thing. Actually, I feel sometimes I can get a bit pessimistic about our industry, but it's 40% of the global CO2 emissions are our sector. It's a sad thing, but it also shows that every day we wake up in the morning and we can do something really significant about climate change. So we should be excited by that, right? And but as construction folks, we can't just think about the pie chart. We also have to think of what is the form that embodied carbon takes. It's the extraction, whether it's fracked or oil or the coal that's used to power the facility. It's the facilities itself and how they have an impact on people, the construction workers, all through the end of the life, like Laura was talking about. So it's really important for us to consider that, especially on Earth Day, right? I've been our company's diversity and inclusion co-chair for a while, and I think it's really important for us to kind of get into our brains that every time that we hear the word embodied carbon, it's important for hitting our global warming reduction goals, but it's also really important for public health, especially during the time of a pandemic, right? Creating a lot of our high GWP materials. It's not just carbon we're worried about. They tend to have lots of different pollution emissions that can interfere with fence line community health. So this is all to say, we're going to go over some kind of technical tools, but keeping that in mind, embodied carbon isn't just an environmental thing, it's a human health issue as well, and contributes to lack of biodiversity. So, all these cute little graphics are things that we need to think about. And, in reality, there are cute little graphics. They're real environmental and human health distractions. So, it's our responsibility, it's our job as engineers, designers, construction people to get the job done. And that doesn't just occur during the design phase. Just like Laura said, it's every different phase of the life cycles thinking about, it's our job to reduce operational carbon, embodied carbon, and these health impacts. So a little work for us up front goes a long way. And I think, and typically, when you start talking about whole building life cycle assessment, you'll start hear people talking about, oh, is it A1 through A3 scope, which is kind of like the cradle to gate. That's really what does it take to put the power into manufacturing, a material or a product. What is that like upfront carbon cost? What's the carbon associated with, the diesel equipment to do all the earth moving and get the material installed? All of the B section is kind of that operational element. And the end of life is, at the end of the day, what happens when, a building owner wants to tear down a building and put in something shiny and new. All of these things emit carbon, and across the whole life cycle, we all can get involved. So, in every single project, there's ways for us to make a difference and reduce embodied carbon. What I'm going to tell you about today, though, I'm going to do a quick little case study that's combining a couple of different projects to avoid, looking too closely at one project, but think of it as any project that you're working on, whether it's a living building challenge project or affordable housing, or maybe you're working on, the latest headquarters for Facebook, or working at a school down the street. Hopefully this can apply to every project that you're working on. So the project that I want to talk to you about, let's say it's a 200,000 square foot building. We want to start out with the baseline, right? We think, okay, we can use Carbon Leadership Forum to establish a baseline for a big office building. We can look at our operational goals. We can take the EUI and the kg CO2e, which is kind of similar, kind of think about EUI, but for embodied carbon. And we can think about really how much carbon is that in that one building. And you can get some pretty big numbers pretty quickly. If you told me what this 40.8 million kg CO2 mean, I wouldn't be able to really tell you. It's a big number, right? So this is what we're starting out with if we really don't work to reduce our operational carbon and to reduce our embodied carbon. If you also take a look at some of the news articles around the Biden administration, they just put, I think it's like $50 of social impact per ton of carbon, I think it is. And so if you use that number, it comes out to 2 million, around $2 million of negative impact from that amount of carbon. So these are all some metrics that you can think about when you're working on your projects to kind of help your team, help the client that you're working for, understand, that this carbon, these decisions have a big impact, right? So, what do we do in sustainability and engineering and construction? We put up some goals, right? All of these are different goals that you might think of, everything from electrifying your building to using good refrigerants to trying to hit, 10% reduction of embodied carbon against your structural materials. Maybe you decide, hey, we're gonna put like a cap on how much embodied carbon we want to hit, and we got to hit a number below that. Maybe these are in line with your living building challenge goals and your LEED certification, and hopefully, sometime in the near future, Cal Green will actually put some more stringent goals on us that requires us to do embodied carbon every day. So I think this kind of sets the tone for what you might see on a project, right? That you've got a big amount of carbon to deal with, and maybe you can get the team to agree to some goals. Cool, right? So the next kind of piece comes into, let's say you're at SD 50%, I guess, and you're like, okay, I've got a Revit model. It's in BIM360. What can I do with it? One important thing to consider is that, that Revit model, that has a lot of information in terms of geometries, volumes, even to some, if you're working with a really great team, actually like materials information embedded in there. So what's really great about that is it should be pretty accurate per project. You can kind of push that down into different software like Tally or EC3 or Beacon or one-click LCA, and that can start to give you some coordinated quantities to really get a good picture of how much embodied carbon you're thinking about. Another way of doing this, maybe if you're a contractor, is really using, your construction takeoffs. It doesn't always have to come from Revit, So if you've got accurate numbers for, putting costs together, that's another way to figure this out. But what's nice about Revit is hopefully it's pretty coordinated across the different design teams, and you can start pushing it into different softwares. So that's where I'm going to kind of talk to you guys a little bit more. So let's say, today, I'm just going to start and kind of explain really quickly how you might use Tally. Tally is not for free, so you'd have to get a subscription, but the way that it works is that, you have a Revit model, you can go into Revit, you can go into your add-ins, you've already paid for Tally and downloaded it. It'll take hopefully a quick job to just open it up. And I promise I'm only going to go really
While that's loading, Kathleen, there's
Yeah.
one quick question in the,
Oh,
well, I don't know if it's quick or not, but there's a question in the chat asking, how do you define your baseline for the case study?
Good question. It's not like ASHRAE 90.1 where there's a really good baseline. It's like there's not really a body that's kind of come together and said, this is what you must do for your baseline. Fortunately, it's still a bit like the Wild West out there. So at least in terms of like a third-party framework like LEED or living building or like zero carbon living building challenge certification, you're kind of up to making a baseline for yourself. Using a Revit model maybe to show that like you're not changing the geometry of the building, in a serious way, or you're not comparing a concrete building to a steel building, if you know what I mean. So there's less of a baseline in terms of like how we have a baseline for ASHRAE 90.1 modeling. But another good way to look at just baselines in terms of more like benchmarks is using the Carbon Leadership Forum has done a large study. I think Luke's company, Studies, also done like a really good study of looking at numbers to kind of benchmark things. So you can start there. Hopefully someone can throw those links in the chat for me. But hopefully that answers the question.
Done. And one thing I would add to that is there are organizations like SC 2050 that are really working to try and have more robust benchmarks.
Again, it takes a village. Like it takes a lot to even get good data to know what these benchmarks are, or what the baselines are to really establish that. Like think of how many, I don't know, millions of energy models, code models have come in to like get us a good idea of operational carbon. We're not there for embodied carbon. So every time you do an embodied carbon model is a data point, right? Hopefully.
And SC 2050 first year. So everyone, any structural engineers, you should sign up, and then your projects start being those data points. That's my last plug. I'll stop interrupting.
Actually, great. Luke, I have a question. So how do we find those is this sort of a database that's just currently being enlarged?
Yeah, it hasn't been launched
or?
yet. It's in the works. It should be coming online this summer, I think like June. And then it'll take a little bit of time for, but all the signatories are responsible for supplying data. So as soon as it starts, it'll be populated.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to just fly through Tally. I'm not even going to really show you too much about it. I just want to use it because I think it's a great thing to kind of think about how life cycle analysis works in general. So, I open my Tally plugin. There's a couple, you can do some different, there's different formats that they have. I typically use the full building study, and it lets you choose from your categories. So, it's important, to think about like what do you want to include in your embodied carbon model? Like, do you only want to include the enclosure of the structures? Maybe you only want to look at structures. Maybe you want to look at everything. But that's like a nice way to kind of select, what you want to do. The other thing that I think, coming from my background where I was used to be doing a lot more Revit and BIM, it's really important to think about like, I don't know, crap in, crap out sort of. Like if you're working, whether it's your model or model from another member of your design team, the Revit data is, if it's not very good data, if it's like there's a lot of random noise in it, if there's a lot of kind of generic models in there, if things aren't very well labeled, you're going to have a really bad time, and you're going to spend a lot of time doing not much good for your project. So one thing that I tend to work with is really asking architects and engineers when they're working in their Revit models to really think about, creating, and this project I'm using as an example is a very early stage project, like still in SDs. And I ask, what work sets can I be using with my Revit? So I know which ones to be pulling from, and that really helps kind of limit the noise. Because you don't want to look at CAD links for embodied carbon. That's not going to help you. Like you want to really be thinking about like, how can I limit the noise? So that's one kind of concrete thing that if you're starting to get into this, I would say is ask people what, maybe they can even create a work set just for your, LCA. I doubt that they will, but there's definitely a way to like, remove the furniture, remove the little people, right?
Can you zoom in, Kathleen?
Yeah, sorry.
It might just up the
No.
boom, if it's possible. Maybe it's not possible, but
I'll take some photos. I'll take some snapshots. But so that's one thing that I would really think about is that when it's loading, that LCA and working with Revit is a great tool, but at the same time, you have to think about what data you're working with and what data isn't going to give you results, right? So let's say I like clicked all the work sets I want to, and it'll generate a quick kind of like a quick overview of all of the, it's working through all of this. If this was a CD model, it would take a long time to do it, but because a lot of this stuff is generic in an SD model, it's going to run through it pretty quickly. And I think that kind of tells you a lot about when you should consider working with a tool like Tally. In my opinion, working with doing LCA models, it's really difficult to get a good run of a model out of an SD model unless you're working with a really sophisticated team that's got a really quick schedule, because a lot of the time you're still moving, architects are still really moving things around in the model, so they won't have the design fleshed out. So, when you're doing this kind of work, also think about, the right tool for the purpose, right? So maybe LCA isn't, whole building LCA is not something you do to close to the end of DD or maybe into CDs when you have more information. But the way that LCA basically works is that it grabs all of the different, it's all the different mullions around the curtain wall. It grabs the volume information. If there's a material in there, you can get some of that information out of it. Like say we're looking at an aluminum mullion. All of that's kind of the greenhouse gas inventory associated with that aluminum mullion, usually a generic element from Tally that's kind of baked in, and you can save it, and that's how Tally runs, right? That's generally like how you should think about,
We're still on. Looks like we
happened?
lost our internet for a minute. Did we all lose our internet for a minute?
Was it?
Yeah, everything.
I can hear you
it
now. And Kathleen is moving, which is good. I think we're back.
Okay,
Right.
Interesting. Zoom just had a brain fart. That's all.
The Chinese want to know what you're saying, Kathleen.
You might be back on mute, Kathleen. I think everyone came back muted.
Anyway, so sorry about that. So when you go and do your report, it's going to tell you. One cool thing about that is if you've done all that work, you've worked with your Revit model. A really cool new feature is that you can throw that Revit model. If you've done all of this work in Tally, you can throw it into EC3 through this little button that I'll show you now when you go to Save Report.
before we go to EC3, Kathleen, can I interject with one other question from the chat?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
I'm sorry, I'm going really fast, but
no. And I hope it's this is our first time kind of doing like a as you go demo. So, but this pertains to Revit and how you're setting up materials and assemblies. Can you give some specifics on, like, are you setting that up in families, or like how are you in particular setting up materials and assemblies so that Tally tracks it correctly? You got muted again somehow, sorry.
So one thing that is what you could think about is that, like, let's say I'm in Tally, there's a cool feature where you can go to isolate the model in Revit, which is really nice. Make sure you have a 3D view open, and it'll highlight your, this mullions that I'm like making up. And let's say I grabbed, I don't know if you guys can see this, sorry. Don't know how to zoom very well for my whole screen, but anyways, if you're an architect and you're drawing the mullions, it's when you go into like edit type, and you can see, there's some thicknesses you want to make sure that's accurate. You can change the actual materials in Revit. Same thing for glass or gyp. Even just labeling things. And that's really to help the LCA, modeler to know what the designer's thinking. So if you're using, it doesn't have to be like super specific. A lot of that information you can look up in the specifications or look up in like a finish schedule, but to help out the poor LCA modeler who's got to do this for probably 2,000 different elements, like labeling your families accurately is really helpful. So like saying, if you're an interior architect and you say it's you're designing a wall assembly and it's like, oh, it's type X gyp, and it's this, and you've modeled it with the right inches of thickness, that really helps because that will get all picked up in Tally, right? But then there's some things that you don't model, like structural engineers. You're not going to model the rebar in your concrete. That's just something that we'd handle like in specifications where it just says like medium reinforcement or something. So some things can just be kind of coordinated in an email or like in a RFI kind of type thing. Some things it's really helpful, especially geometries, to handle it in Revit by calling out the name, making sure you're being accurate. But obviously, most people aren't going to do that in SD because it's a waste of time. So that's kind of why I'm saying like a tool like Tally might not be super useful in SD. Think about it maybe once you're moving into further stages of DD when you're starting to get, the team's getting shit together, right? So that's my general advice.
One follow up there. So it's pretty common to have, like, say you have a concrete job, it's pretty common to have different concrete mixes. Is that something you usually define, like you would define on your project, like as 4,000 versus
totally.
6,000?
So like let's see if I can find. So right, so like this model, I don't know what generic 6 is. It could be anything, but structural concrete, that's probably some concrete. So in Tally, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to go into the concrete casting place, and then you can kind of choose. Let's say, it's a hefty slab. It's 6,000 PSI. Then I can go in and identify what the fly ash is, the slag. There might even be some, like the regional average. And this is kind of how in Tally you're going to do one model with a baseline, and maybe you say, well, LA is really bad for baseline concrete, so I'm going to see my baseline 0. But then we've worked with the concrete manufacturers and they've really bumped up the fly ash, and that's going to be the difference in your embodied carbon savings, if that makes sense. So that information isn't going to necessarily be in your Revit model. That's going to live in the structural engineer's specs or their narrative, or could be in multiple places. But so you're kind of pulling information just like an energy modeler would from all different types of places. But this is the stuff that you should be thinking about with your team, to be like, okay, what's all the different information I have? How am I going to get it? How are we going to like troubleshoot when things don't make sense? So a lot goes into just doing this part of embodied carbon, if that makes sense.
Just to add a little bit onto that, I think in Tally, it's going to be based off of the Revit in a pure volume takeoff, or there's kind of three elements. It'll be by volume, by area, by length, and it's going to be, it's going to be responsive to what type of kind of Revit component that is. So right, for something like the concrete example, it's going to be by volume, and then there's also kind of an additional contextual element depending on what type of material it is. So for example, for the concrete, rebar is kind of the contextual addition that you can you don't need to add within the Revit model. That's part of the Tally, would be adding the rebar. Another example would be if you have like a wall with a wooden construction, you would just you can choose to kind of just have the linear value or the area of that wall. And then one of the contextual elements would be you would manually in Tally add like the stud spacing. And so it's kind of, there's certain elements that only appear based off of the need of different types of Revit components. And so just quickly, and I think that something we'll frequently do is just kind of go by convention in the beginning in SD, and then as the project goes on, right, you can kind of further develop that as you customize things and make decisions.
Okay, one question as we transition, as we go from Tally to EC3, is do you need the material defined to map to EC3?
So, I think one of the benefits of mapping to EC3 from Tally is that like you've done a lot of that work and you're pushing into EC3, having already kind of sifted through the noise and like applied different like EPDs, or you've applied different, kind of material aspects to your model. So you've done a lot of that in Tally, and, it's nice because in Tally, you can check things like different elements and check them within like the 3D model and make sure that you're like, oh, is this a curtain wall panel, or is this like actually more of like a shading element, and that's wood versus, so that's really nice to do in Tally, I find, but it's not the only way to work with EC3. So that's just one route that I would recommend maybe in the later stages of your projects is you're going directly from Revit into Tally. You can run your whole building analysis in there. You can create your documentation for LEED if you want to. But then if you want to get really into the nitty gritty, you can export that EC3 and really get going. So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of EC3. You go to type in EC3 to Google. It will come up with all this fun stuff about a wrestler. That's not what we're doing today, but it's just like a fun part of your job is that you get to learn about different wrestlers, also named EC3. And you go to Building Transparency, which is a tool, open source tool, which is really cool. You're going to log in. I'm going to log into my account, and then you're going to see a lot of different elements. Okay, so I've like zoomed into the tab on the left. There's a couple of different things to point out. The first is that you don't need to have a Revit model to just do a quick review of like how different products might stack up. I really love doing this in the beginning of my projects because maybe you don't have the budget, or maybe you don't have embodied carbon scope at all, but you want to look at how to reduce embodied carbon in your different materials. Like let's say you're looking at insulation and you want to do a quick, a little like off the back napkin analysis of blanket insulation. So you can use EC3 to look at, a different insulation, like maybe you want to look at mineral wool because, that's what, you've spec'd and you're only looking at wall insulation, but, you can look at whatever you want. This is typically how I use EC3, both in the beginning of my projects and also towards the end when I'm trying to help designers think about specification changes or looking at a finished schedule. And so this is kind of a cool way of using EC3. If you can't use Revit at all, it's been too long for you since you've looked at it, but you deal with, speccing materials a lot. this is a really cool tool to use. And I like it because it's really easy to start getting. So you can see we've got 33 products in here. We can compare embodied carbon by different manufacturers, which is pretty cool, and it kind of gives you an idea of where they might stack up for different mineral wool products. That's to say, there's only 33 EPDs in here out of gosh knows how many exist in the United States. But it's just a cool way to look at, when you're looking at your specs or you're looking at the beginning of a project and you want to see which manufacturers stack up the best. Start playing around in it. I think it's a really powerful tool. And even at the very end of a project, like let's say you really dropped the ball and no one knew about embodied carbon until the very last minute, you can still make changes at the very end of your products by saying, who's the best manufacturer that I could use for the money? So this to me is like a great way of using EC3, whether you're a contractor, whether you're an architect. There's even some mechanical insulation in there for the mechanical folks. You can look at concrete, stuff you probably already know, the higher the PSI, the more, the higher the carbon, but this is like a really cool way that's not reliant on BIM skills or like extensive. You're not going to get a really accurate number out of this part of it, but you're going to get an idea of how you can improve things just with material selection or manufacturing selection, which is really dope, right? So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is this part called plan and compare buildings. So I've got lots of buildings in here. Don't look at it too close, some things are confidential. But like this is where all my buildings live in EC3, and the way that I work with them is, so you can, instead of going from a Revit model into Tally into EC3, what you can do is that you can go directly from BIM360 and import into EC3. You just have to make sure that your BIM guru has installed the app within your company's BIM360 account and within like the architect that you're working with BIM360 account. So the way that you do it, like let's see, we're gonna go into like a project that's almost done, a project called Santa Monica Yards. We can go in. What I would say is that all you're basically doing is you go in and you can import the project, hit save, it'll grab the data.
Is that importing from a view, or what are the three options there?
They're all different views. I honestly don't know the difference between them. It seems like a lot of the time only new construction ever works, but I don't know, play around with it. I mean, most of the time 3D doesn't work for me. So I usually use the new construction, and you can open up your BIM report in 3D, and I'll give you a little picture of the model. This is like a very simple project in like really early design stages, so there's not much in there, but you can see, oh wow, stuff's been brought in, that's cool. And you can also see some stuff hasn't brought in because it doesn't know what it is. Like that's probably like a generic floor, so it's like I don't know what this is. So then you can go back to my buildings and you'll see that this product has been wrapped in from BIM360, and this is where you're going to go in and kind of mess around with, you're going to want to add, let's say that this, like all of these numbers don't make sense for the project. Just pretend that they're all accurate, but they aren't for this particular project. Say it's a lodging. What's great about EC3 is that it's going to quickly give you some baseline numbers based off of what information it's pulling. So, other like Tally, where you've kind of gone in and like double checked things and kind of gut checked them against the model, there's not a really good way of like looking at the 3D model to kind of go in and double check. It's just bringing in what it can. It's less helpful for like really being able to know for sure what you're doing if you're doing it this way, but you can see some stuff's being brought in successfully, right? Like CMUs, metal studs, and if you're working on the project, hopefully what things are working, but you might get some kind of crazy stuff like you don't really, the barn door is going to be really difficult. It's bringing in noise, right? So one thing that I always recommend checking is you can go to this BIM report as a CSV, and that will show you like what's been brought in and what hasn't been brought in. You can also start playing around with EC3 makes some really nice summary charts for you. Like maybe you want to, maybe you want to show, like we'll look at a more complicated building, but you can start to show, what's your most, with your building, what is like the biggest components by mass. So that can kind of help, understand, wow, what is the stuff that we really need to be focusing on. They've also got some cool Sankey's, like bar charts that can show, once you start applying EPDs, how you're getting savings. So I'm not going to get too far into this, but that's just like the tool to bring in, directly from BIM360, bringing it into EC3. But what I wanted to show you is the project that I've made public for y'all to kind of play around with, which is the CLF LA example. So let's pretend it's a project in Olympia, Washington. And this is a project that I've been working on, where we brought the project in from Revit. I worked on it in Tally with the architect and the structural engineer and the interior designer. And then I pushed it into EC3. And then I started applying real EPDs that I had confirmed with the construction team. So
Hey, quick question, Kathleen.
Yeah.
So I am in my own EC3 account. How do I find your building that you've made public? Thank you.
Kathleen is muted again.
Sorry. Yeah, so go into public, and this model will be in there. You can even destroy stuff. It is what it is, I guess. It's not like, it's just like it's a good learning tool, but there's other public projects in there too.
Found it. Thank you.
You can see, you can kind of see that it's like very cleaned up compared to like, a model that I brought in, like a really early SD model where it was straight from BIM360. A lot of this stuff I've checked with the contractor. In some instances in our Revit model, we didn't have the foundation. So I got this, I got like the foundation, the volume of concrete for the foundation and the rebar, that all came from the contractor. So they gave me like an actual pounds of concrete. And then what's really cool about EPD or EC3 that I love is that, you'll get that information in, and then you can actually choose which EPD you're using. So, there's 67 different types of EPDs for structural rebar. And I'm using a very specific new core rebar based out of Seattle that's been chosen for recycled content to lower the embodied carbon, and it's used with a sustainable process that's less energy intensive than like blast arc furnace. So we've gone and made that decision as a team that we're going to source from that manufacturer, from that plant, to reduce embodied carbon. And I can select this EPD. The EPD, like, it's kind of like linked into the EC3 tool, so you can download it, you can read about it, you can see that there's a large amount of uncertainty with these. So, these aren't exact science, it's giving it a ballpark information because this is the number that's been provided by the manufacturer. It has been third-party reviewed, but embodied carbon I still think is a bit more of an art than a science. So you'll see all the information in there. You can double check the EPD and see what's kind of going into the manufacturing of this particular type of concrete reinforcing. And then that's going to give you an exact carbon amount that then gets applied across your project, right? It's pretty simple. What's the EPD factor? Multiply it by the pounds of rebar, you get a number. Yay. that's basically what we're doing. We're applying EPDs, specific EPDs. Sometimes I have a placeholder. I'm still waiting to hear back from the current supplier on the terrible aluminum. If you're an architect, please figure out a different way to do aluminum mullions. They kill it. They kill it. They're terrible for embodied carbon. So as I'm like adding we're making actual decisions, getting information back from the contractor, making decisions on the specs, we can really understand where these numbers are going to move. Like, for example, we just found out that our cross-laminated timber manufacturer just got their EPD, so we're waiting for them to upload it to EC3. So this number isn't just like a generic number. It's actually going to be tied to a real EPD, which is really cool. So it's nice. You can put in little notes so the team knows what you're thinking about. So that's how it will, it'll give you your realized number. So it's still, for this particular fake building, it's 4 million kg CO2, but we've got like about 50% savings calculated from using the baseline of all these different materials, like the US averages. And that's when you can start getting into more.
Sorry, can you guys still hear me?
We can still hear you.
Sorry.
Okay.
So in this case,
Hello?
your baseline is set up. Yeah, nice. Is set up by industry average EPDs.
Yeah, so that's where this is coming from, and so like for example, let's say a project you have to meet the zero carbon certification. And that's got like a cap of 500 kg CO2e. So that's where, my realized, I'm dividing this by my square footage to see if I fall within that number. It's also got this like really nice tool where you can put in your operational EUI, and if it's if the electrified 100%, not using natural gas for anything, you can put in, your where your electricity is coming from, this is just like the public version of it, so it's kind of obscured a lot of the details. So if you wanted to, if you're in LA, you get like a certain LA number, and it gives you your operational carbon too, so you can look at your little terrible graph of how much carbon your building's going to do over the next couple of years. But these are great, these graphs are made for you, so like use them. And you can check and see, you can, go ahead.
That's great. Quick question. What is your scope for this project? What was included in your scope?
So this was a project where actually we were only the sustainability consultant, and
to be specific,
cool.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The question's LCA scope, so like A1 through whatever, but
right,
also business scope is interesting too.
Right. So I guess we're only the I guess I don't know really. I've on embodied carbon projects, I guess because typically I'm like the sustainability consultant, which I think is nice because you're kind of like the third party, and you're getting all the information from everybody and running this. But there's if you're a structural engineer, you can totally do this for your scope. For the scope of the LCA, we're using both the it's annoying. We're trying to meet LEED Platinum and do the ILFI zero carbon, which if you're a sustainability consultant, read the fine print because the scopes are different, which is really annoying. But for this one, we're including a lot. So we're doing structural, the enclosure, wall assemblies, and part of this is because the client wanted us to do it, and flooring. So it was kind of like a hybrid scope, but like LEED only requires you to do structures and enclosure, I think. So it's super easy to do. But part of me feels like that once you have the, maybe you have like a really shoestring budget and you're just gonna, you don't want to donate your time to the project, so you have to really draw a circle around what you're doing. But I think there'll come a day when we really need to include finishes in the embodied carbon models. And especially because insulation is a ton of carbon. Same thing for gyp. Gyp is a ton of carbon. The steel in our stupid wall assemblies, it's a ton of carbon. So even though these are small compared to the massive amounts of concrete and the aluminum mullions and things like that, they still add up, right? Especially over thousands of projects nationwide. But so hopefully that answered the question. But these are just some of the cool Sankeys.
Kathleen?
Yep, go ahead.
You can't see the chat or you're focused.
Awesome.
So it was a question on the modules and A, B, or C, A, B, and C, and EC3, I'm pretty sure is just A1 through A3.
Yes.
Because it's based on EPDs.
Yeah.
Which
and
generally are just cradle to gate.
Yes. And what we had to do for a project, for some projects, is that if you're only using EC3, one thing, big role for contractors is to start actually tracking the carbon. And like, I'm going to say this to contractors now, but I'm telling you, it's coming for you. It's tracking, think about all your diesel equipment. Like, think about your site work, you're digging holes into the ground to put in underground parking. You're demolishing buildings and building new buildings. That is so much carbon, like dwarfs. I'm telling you, can dwarf the whole project. So I think that scrutiny is coming for contractors. So the sooner that you think about that, the better. And that's completely different than any of this LCA stuff, right? But you could be making, as a contractor, you can be looking for equipment that doesn't use diesel, or how can you power your trailers with solar panels, right? I never thought of that. Like that's an enormous amount of carbon over, especially a long-term project. So there's so many different ways to get involved in this. But yes, you're totally right. This is only A1 through A3 scope. So if you're only using this, you're only using EC3 as your tool. You can't meet the LEED credit yet. There's a pilot credit that you can go for, which I'm not going to get into. But like if you're trying to get through zero carbon certification, you use your EC3 tool, but then you have to track the contractor has to track all of the concrete, like using Excel, getting information from like the subs and tracking equipment and lights and stuff. So it's hard. It's a lot of work. Don't take it lightly for sure. But then if you're using Tally, I think it creates like a estimate of A4 and A5 for you, or maybe it doesn't. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. I should know. So it's important to know that EC3 only deals with A1 through A3, but it's a lot of the carbon, and it's a great way to know that you're going to make a difference in a project, and you don't need to do a whole building LCA. And it's got all these cool safety charts that you can use to make clients get really into carbon and help you understand how where you should target embodied carbon. So I think I'll stop there. I guess we've run out of time. Sorry.
Yeah, it's really insightful. I just want to say thanks so much for sharing your expertise with the group, Kathleen. You're really a sustainability powerhouse, I think, for the city. So keep being a champion. We can keep I don't know if there are more questions. We can keep going, but I understand a lot of times people have to drop off, and Kathleen may have to drop off.
I have a quick question. Where on the tool is let me bring where you were able to show the graph of embodied and operational carbon?
So you gotta so when you're in a project, it'll be within one of these like little tabs, embodied versus operational. It's a little through a lot of trial and error, things like the graphics won't come up, like all these cute little summary charts. They won't come up until you put within the building use. Make sure that you put in the square footage and put in your typology and put in your address, because it just won't show up. So for like months, I didn't realize it was even an option. You don't need to put in some of this stuff like floor series and height. You don't need to put that in. But yeah, the embodied carbon and operating carbon lives in here, so you can play around with different EUIs and different mixes of gas and electricity. And this is really helpful, I think, for clients when you're trying to force them into electrification, because
Yeah.
they're like, oh gosh, I don't want to be on the.
And where did you pull up? Where'd you generate that chart showing both the embodied and the?
This one.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Cool.
Mhm.
Nice. Thank you.
Totally.
So I have a practical follow-up to at the beginning when you first started importing from BIM360, you said your firm has to install the plugin. Like that has to be done through the firm's BIM360, like at a
And
corporate
Kathleen,
level.
Kathleen,
Oh
you're
yeah,
muted.
sorry. So I'll drop this into the chat. This took me a long time to figure out.
Yeah, asking for a friend.
Yeah. So just get you can kind of get your BIM guru to like help you with this. I had to have mine help. That they have like the master BIM360 account, and they have apps, right? There's different apps in BIM360. If you want to make sure that you can do this on your end, and I'll actually share in the Slack. I have like a boilerplate email of the email that I sent to architects to make sure they've done it too. Because then they'll tell their BIM guru, and then everything will work. And I would say there's a really nice feature in EC3 called report bugs and feedback. So for me, I was trying to import a project recently, and for whatever reason it wouldn't import, and I still don't know why. You can just send a little user snap in your email and say, please help me, I'm distraught, I can't do this and I have a deadline. And you can be like, I don't know what this is or whatever. And they'll get back to you really quick. They're really lovely people.
Yes, Sandra also mentioned Phil, who's like the software guy who leads us, and that there's plans to link the EC3 with Tally. You can add to that, Sandra, if you want, if you're still on. She might have dropped off. I'm not sure. But yes, nice people.
They add new EPDs and stuff like every day. So I don't know, it's worth checking out. Just I would say, like, if you're just getting started, start playing around with the materials comparisons, because it really helped me, I think, in like, I'm a materials nerd, but like it really, like, looking at different types of insulation or looking at different, like, I'm not an architect, I don't know wall finishes, so like it's been really helpful to like think about that. So yeah, I would say just start playing around with things. You can look at steel. There's a lot of different options to look at, and you can do that in your own scope. You can like give a friendly nudge during SD to say, hey, why can we look at this manufacturer? Should we use, this through the curtain walls? Mullions need to be aluminum. Could we possibly? I think I was asking Laura the other day. Is there such a thing as timber mullions? It's a good way to start asking questions, right? And we can. We don't need to have a lot of money to do a whole building scope. We can start with just a single, like. We can start looking at manufacturers and holding them accountable to like why their products suck, right? So, yeah.
It's such a great point too, saying even if you don't think about this till the very end, procurement is so important that you can still make changes and have an impact.
Yeah, and like if you're an architecture firm or I don't know, any type of firm, and you're like, we've got like a selection, like we know, let me see where it is, like finishes. Like if you know that you spec carpet and you spec the same manufacturers and the same type of flooring like carpet tile every job, check it and see how terrible it is. I mean, that's like a cool way that, like, if you're working with your materials library to really make, imagine doing that across your whole
hit the compare
portfolio
button under manufacture, because that's brings up a nice diagram.
Yeah,
You see
like,
immediately
Cool.
how.
it really stacks up, and you could make that change across your whole company. Like if you work for a big company, that's a ton of carbon, and maybe it's not a ton of carbon. And well, I guess I was going to show you this slide. Sorry, I kind of overdid it on slides, but like this is for that project, right? And some of this information is kind of outdated, but obviously the concrete's really low because we designed it out, but and the purple bars are the baseline, the green is like what's possible, and the yellow color is what we were able to achieve. And even though these insulation and gyp and ceiling panels and carpet are small compared to my project, they're on every building. They just add up. Every interiors project, that stuff adds up, right? Every existing building. So even if it's small in your project, in the grand scheme of things, we really need the market to change. So, maybe you couldn't get, cross laminated timber on your project. You could still go for the best carpet. So I just think it's like a hopeful feeling of knowing that at any stage in the project, there's some nice tools that you can use, whether you're doing a whole building LCA using Tally or just looking at manufacturers and cleaning up their specs. We can have a big, a big impact, for this particular project. We're able to say asterisk that it's like 20 million kg CO2 saved because we really focused on really reducing our primary structural carbon, looking at different facade options and pushing our finishes into a better point. And I've got this slide too. There's all these different techniques that you can get into for reducing embodied carbon that you don't need to quantify with the whole building LCA. It's just going to save carbon, so there's a lot of different things that we can think about, I guess. But I don't know. I guess I'm going way over time.
I know Tally includes other things like it starts to get into like besides just carbon, like eutrophication or other maybe healthy material sorts of things. Is that included in EC3 as well, or EC3 is just the EPDs, global warming?
Well, EPDs include all those 6 categories that you alluded to, 5, 6, but EC3 is only the carbon.
Gotcha.
But if you dig into what's cool about EC3 is you can dig into all those EC3s. They have them. All those EPDs. Too many letters. They will have all the data is drawn from a real EPD, so you can find those, those different categories. But it will not be comparing anything but carbon.
Yeah, Jill's totally right. I think that they're trying to build out the other 6 impacts within EC3 because every EPD has those 6 impacts accounted for. But I think just to make things simple for their user interface and for their team, they've only looked at looking at GWP. But when you use Tally, it'll tell you all of the different other impacts, and they're important, right? Like our oceans shouldn't. We don't want our oceans to acidify, and smog's terrible. So they're important things to look at too. So Tally does that currently. But you could do it in Excel. You can grab a bunch of EPDs and make a little chart and grab that data out of an EPD. That's how EC3 is basically working. It's just grabbing that data out of EPDs and applying it across. So
I think carbon may be kind of the granddaddy of them all, in that high carbon you're going to have. It doesn't seem to be directly correlated, and I guess we'd have to look at a couple of EPDs, but too much carbon in the atmosphere creates acidification of the oceans and smog, and it has a lot of impacts. So I don't know if you would have a high carbon emitting material with low acidic. I don't know how they measure those environmental impacts. That
And
gets definitely into
yeah.
the weeds of the EPD.
I think one thing
process.
that we've noticed with like glulam and mass timber is that you tend to get high eutrophication because of like the fertilizer and stuff. It's just kind of like, it's definitely, you know, it's not the same ballpark as like concrete and GWP, but it's something that I think, you know, we should look at the evidence and, you know, say to our lovely CLT manufacturers, hey, you know, how do we reduce this impact on the environment, right? So like, I think that's a cool thing too. It's like the power of looking at the data up front, because you'll be like, whoa, why is the eutrophication on my project higher? And then you're like, oh, maybe it's the, you know, maybe it's the carpet has a certain, like you can look at that EPD and say, wow, that carpet has a pretty high eutrophication or ozone. So it's depletion potential. So some things might be surprising, you know, and there's no perfect product, I guess, but I think even most of the bio-based materials are going to be the way to go, for sure.
The challenge is not to get too lost in the weeds that you give up. Like start somewhere.
Totally. And I would say that, like, you know, one of the things that's really helped us is talk to, you know, attend the BIM kickoff, especially if you're thinking about doing a whole building LCA, and talk about work sets with people and ask about their naming conventions and figure out what level of detail that you're going to get to in their Revit model, because it can be, you know, like we really want to think about, you know, a lot for us as consultants or engineers, our time is money, you know, for a project. So if we really want to like get a bang for your buck, like how can we make sure we're not spinning our wheels, to Jill's point, like getting lost in the details? How can we make sure that our models are in really good shape? You know, once we bring them into Tally or bring them into EC3, that can really save time and prevent a lot of headaches, so that we can get to the embodied carbon savings portion of it. Or, you know, just if embodied carbon analysis isn't for you, you can look at the EPDs and make improvements there. It's not like, it's not the only tool that we have in our toolbox.
Again, this is so great, Kathleen, like really important information. I mean, I feel like we'll have to have this sort of like LCA workshop type thing, you know, fairly, you know, a few times a year, just to, you know, we could come up with more questions and look at more tools, and there's a lot we can dive into, and I think that could be a good thing for this group to do, or have one of the working groups tackle. But
yeah,
are there any,
and if anybody has you know, as you're working through LCAs or getting started in EC3 or Tally, if you have questions, you can come to the CLF LA Slack, or you can go to the Carbon Leadership Forum online community, and we're all hanging out there and ready to help people out and answer questions and collaborate to build everyone's knowledge. So if you're not already there, can we get a link in the chat?
And an easy way to access all of this is through our amazing website, clf-la.org.
awesome, Slack link in the chat, clf-la.org, going in the chat.
Awesome. You beat me to it, Luke. Well done.
And we'll we'll get a recording up on the website as well. But this has been fun as always. Are there any other questions before we close it? Final thoughts? Happy Earth Day, everyone.
Happy Earth Day.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right, thanks again,
Thanks,
Kathleen.
Kathleen.
Thanks,
Really
everyone.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Good night.
Bye.